Welcome to the Depth Dialogues podcast,
where we explore how depth psychology is applied to tackle contemporary social issues.
I'm Kirk Schneider.
And I'm Tyler Gamlin. Hey, welcome back, everyone. On today's episode of Depth Dialogues, we're honored to host two leaders in existential therapy, Dr. Emmy van Deurzen and Dr. Mick Cooper. Dr. Emmy van Deurzen is a globally celebrated existential psychotherapist, philosopher, and author. As the founder and principal of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in London, she has trained countless therapists and established existential therapy as a cornerstone of psychological practice. Her influential books, such as Existential Counselling and Psychotherapy in Practice and Paradox and Passion in Psychotherapy, have inspired generations of clinicians and thinkers to embrace the human capacity for meaning, resilience, and authenticity. Joining her is Dr. Mick Cooper, a leader in humanistic, existential, and pluralistic therapies. As a chartered psychologist and professor of counseling psychology at the University of Roehampton, Dr. Cooper's contributions span innovative research on shared decision-making and mental health in schools to authoring key texts like existential therapies and working at relational depth in counseling and psychotherapy. Together, these visionary thinkers will share some of their insights on the evolving role of existential therapy in addressing the complexities of the human experience in today's world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emmy van Deurzen and Dr. Mick Cooper to the Depth Dialogues podcast.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us, Mick and Emmy, kindred spirits, truly. And of course, we've known each other for quite a number of years and really look forward to this excursion with you. I thought we'd start off with finding out a little bit more about the background for both of you in terms of the existential movement. And Emmy, maybe we'll start with you, since you're really the inspiration for the existential movement. Can you share with us your motivation for sparking this movement? What were the sort of pivotal moments that moved you to, think about a whole global movement? And I should mention also that we are very much affiliated with that movement, with our Core of Depth Healers movement, which we're beginning here in the United States and North America. We're considered a hub of the existential movement. There are a number of hubs, and the existential movement is a global organization that is trying to bring existential and depth principles to social issues throughout the world. So maybe you can share more, Emmy, about your
Absolutely.
for this.
Thank you, Kirk. And I am so delighted that you are working with the existential movement and that you're so actively developing all of this in the United States. Goodness alone knows how much this is needed in our world. I think nothing much more needs to be said about that. But let's talk a little bit about where it comes from. So it comes from us all beginning to explore working together across the globe in existential therapy, I think. So from 2015 onwards, when we had the first World Congress for Existential Therapy in London, we began to find ways to bring existential therapy together as a more internationally based movement and to bring different aspects of existential therapy together rather than have all these splits between us.
Yes.
But out of that, I think we began to realize that most of us feel very strongly that it isn't just about the therapy. We're not just interested in doing therapy with people. We're actually interested in the ideas, the existential ideas, the philosophical ideas, the psychological ideas, and the psychotherapeutic applications. But we were also aware that these need to be applied beyond the consulting room in people's ordinary walks of life, in their everyday existence, in what is happening to them that they don't think they need to go to psychotherapist for, but they still need to make sense of what is going on. And there are so very few theories and ways of looking at the world to help people in doing that. And most of them are either religion-based or science-based, so science and technology-based, I should hasten to add, rather than philosophy-based, because philosophy has become a rather sort of separate, academically based branch that doesn't speak much to ordinary people. So it became obvious that there is a gap in this world where philosophy needs to be applied in a practical way, in the same way in which we do that in the consulting room. But we need to somehow unpack that and make that available to ordinary people amongst, the whole population, the wider public, but also specifically to address social and political issues, and hopefully work with politicians and work with the media and just shift the worldview that is dominating, which is basically a materialistic worldview in which people get trapped very often in a kind of meaningless existence where they feel everything is trivial. So there is a long road to go there. But what is extremely encouraging is that we have so many colleagues from around the world who feel about this in exactly the same way, and who feel the same urgency, really, to do something about that. So that is why the motto of the existential movement is to bring wisdom to the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. I also feel like we, as you implied, we really have a meaning crisis
Yeah.
parts of the world, and certainly existentialism as a movement has so many riches to bring to bear on this crisis, and that's a part of what really energizes me about this movement. And Mick, can you share with us your sensibility about the movement and
I
contribution?
I guess to say a bit about my background, I trained at one of the schools that Emmy set up in the late 90s as an existential psychotherapist. Sadly, didn't have Emmy as a teacher. We missed her a lot. Um, and then went on to be involved in the person-centered community and the humanistic community. And I guess I see myself, and well, I work with a colleague, John McLeod, to set up what we call pluralistic therapy, which is a kind of a community, which is very much for me based on existential principles about appreciating the uniqueness and the diversity of clients to the point where there's, I guess we would see there's been lots of different kinds of practices and wisdoms and knowledges, and really trying to be as open as possible to the whole range of different ways in which people can be helped. And most recently, I've been involved in developing an organization called the Therapy and Social Change Network Task, which is, we've had Emmy along, Kurt, you've been along to talk to us, and it's really a very kind of broad church of people interested from the whole therapeutic field and outside the therapeutic field in social change, and really taking the principles that have been developed within our field and thinking about what implication those can have for a more collaborative, peaceful, tolerant, compassionate society that values diversity, that functions democratically. And I guess for me, so I see I see it very much rooted in my own existentialism. I see those values very, very much at the core of how I've gone into that wider field. And I think also I see existential practices and thoughts as one way of fostering that positive social change in terms of things like choices and ability to help people make choices, taking responsibility. I think that's something massive that I learned from the existential field about the need for people to hold responsibility really and not look for others or ways to change things. So lots of things I'm sure that we will talk about what that means, and how existential thinking can contribute to a better world, a
Yeah,
more just world, better and more just, more thriving, more just.
yeah. So you're very much a hub of the existential movement as well, or the work that you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been involved in the existential movement, and I think it's a wonderful initiative. I'm probably more aligned with, I mean, I've been more involved with tasks, but I see myself very much aligned with the existential movement as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Tyler, did you have a?
Well, I would say I definitely relate to Emmy what you were saying about, colleagues around the world and the idea of beyond the consulting room. I hear it as almost a tagline. This is really what drives me and what I talk to people about when they ask me what I hope to do. And it's not just therapy, in quotes, just therapy, but there's this vast, rich base of knowledge. And most of the time it's only inhabited in this consulting room. And it's so nice to see. And this is what drove me to contact Kirk initially when he had reached out about, starting this movement. And I just connected with that. I said, this is how I feel. This is what I'd love to be involved in. And I'm just so glad that there is something that's happening in this world, and that I can be involved in that and hopefully make some sort of impact. And I'm just grateful for you to be here and share your thoughts on that. So
we're counting on you, Tyler. You're the next generation.
no pressure. That's all right. Well, I have great teachers, so I'll be learning so much from the two of you today.
I mean, it was interesting. I was just this weekend at the National Conference of our Psychotherapy organization that Emmy was very involved in setting up. And the whole conference really was about, this was people from all different orientations. And really the whole conference was about how the role of psychotherapy in a changing world. And there was a lot of talk about how different forms of psychotherapy can and need to contribute to social justice. There was discussion of EDI initiatives, looking at diversity and ethnicity and what contribution that should play. So I think there's a real hunger very much in the existential field. Although, I mean, it's interesting. Maybe we can talk about this. I think when I trained as an existential therapist, I was a bit surprised and maybe a bit disappointed by how much within the existential world there was sometimes a focus very much on the individual, on private practice. I think I'd expected because I came into it from a progressive background, and I think I saw existential and Jean-Paul Sartre and saw it as a very radical set of ideas. But I think at times it does much more focus on private practice issues. There's ways of reading existential thought that are quite politically conservative, I think, in terms of the responsibility of the individual and people's lives and what they choose it to be, and issues like class and gender and race. These are things that kind of people bring into their lives. Yeah, and I think what's exciting is to bring out more of the kind of radical edges of that existential field, which I think can easily be kind of rounded off and lost. To the detriment of what I think existential ideas and therapy could be.
Yeah, so maybe we can get even more concrete here and find out more about, both of you are in the UK. How are you applying these principles to social crises in your own realm, your own country? Can you share with us some specifics about how you're applying these principles of healing and social justice currently?
Well, I think the social justice is more something that Mick could speak about because he really specializes in that and his organization really focuses on that. I am actually much more interested in teaching people how to think differently about what it means to be alive, to be a human being, and to expand their understanding of their own lives in ways they had not realized were possible. So, for instance, I keep a very active YouTube channel where I address very kind of day-to-day issues. I do sort of 2 or 3 a week, and I will answer people's questions to help people think, sort of open it up for themselves and question their normal way of thinking about these things. And that will involve very practical things like how to deal with a panic attack, but it will also be about reflecting on yourself, taking time to make room in your life for a completely different experience of those few years that you are alive, and to wonder what you're here for, and to ask yourself whether you're actually thinking about that at all and are looking really at the world and at yourself and at the people around you, and how you can improve the quality of your life by simply inserting that kind of wandering mentality, that observing phenomenological mentality, and engage with your existence instead of constantly trying to disengage from your existence. Because that is, I think, what we see happening when clients come to my consulting room. What happens immediately is that they present symptoms, and then when they go a little bit deeper into that layer below that, it gets to this kind of thing of, well, these symptoms have arisen because of frustrations and because of pressures and stresses in their lives. And these are there because they've just followed this path or that path, but they've never really taken time to think about who they are, why they are, what they are, who they are with, and where they want to go in their lives. What is the direction and the purpose of their life? So these big philosophical questions are the ones I think the world is missing. And I think it is because we don't ask those questions and don't have them in view and don't take time to ponder on those that we get so many social problems. Because if people were aware of these things and we engaged with them, then the social problems would be obviously things that we need to deal with. But if you have to force people to go do something for other people before they have had a chance to wake up to their own lives and to their own pain and their own troubles and to make some sense of those, it's very hard to get them to do that. And so I think all of that is linked, and we need to do all of that at the same time. We need to address all of these layers of existence in many different ways.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about what you're doing is that you're making the existential work, the focus on deeper reflection, on presence, we might say,
Yeah,
much more accessible for people and affordable, presumably, right? I mean, the YouTube channel is a free,
absolutely.
interactive
Well,
medium.
except that, of course, it works with advertising and stuff a lot. So it is a commercial product, but people can access it for free. So yeah.
I think that's a huge piece in this, is making these principles much more available for everyday people.
It's very democratic. It's
Very,
people from everywhere and from lots of different layers of society. It's quite remarkable. I find it fascinating,
So
really fascinating.
your reach is well beyond the UK, I assume it
Oh
with
my
the
goodness, yes, yes. UK is nothing anymore now. Most of my viewers are in the USA, in Canada, Australia, South America, and elsewhere.
It also strikes me that you're helping people to work with their fears.
Yeah,
This is one of the major themes that we center on too, is uh, our sense that these things are very primal, that a lot of
yeah,
what drives the human experience today and historically, but maybe in a certain ways even more today because we have such access to distractions and quick fixes that we
yeah.
don't really learn skills to work with our fears and to be more deliberative because of that. It was just more
I think
knee-jerk.
we also underestimate how many fears there are in people's lives, how many difficulties everybody is exposed to. You often see people arguing that we don't need these fear responses because we only needed them when we had to face tigers and lions, and we don't need to do that anymore. You must be kidding. We are facing such complicated things every day. When I was telling you about setting up a YouTube channel, I mean, goodness sakes, all the layers of understanding you need for that. When you go out, to go into London from outside of London, the traveling you have to do, the organizing of tickets, all the people you encounter, all the poverty you encounter, all the people who look miserable you encounter. You're constantly exposed to threats all day long. So we're actually accumulating a great deal of worry and trouble and fear and a desire to isolate ourselves from it and to ward it off and to safeguard ourselves. And as Heidegger would say, to become opaque by forgetting to think and by distracting ourselves and, not really allowing nothingness in our lives.
Yeah, I might frame that as the sense of groundlessness and helplessness that is so, seems to me, is so integral to so many of these ways that we want to skim surfaces or, stay in a routine, very safe and familiar routine, even if that's making us miserable, making others miserable,
And that's modeled.
and it's modeled. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
It's like the proper way to live. There's all these different ways in which you can forget, all these different ways in which you can distract yourself from your problems. Substances, screens, things you can do, games. Everything is there to fill all your time and never to sit alone or walk alone in nature and actually allow silence, allow your thoughts about your death, allow your thoughts about your failures, allow your thoughts about your fears, and actually feel it. And then realize that when you do that, presence arises in that nothingness.
Yes.
There is something that emerges automatically. Answers come to you. And I think people block their emptiness and therefore they're blocking their own capacity to find their inner answers in life.
And of course, that's a lot of what we discover in existential therapy is that staying with a lot of these feelings, and having a helpful witness support us in that can help us to feel and see the more of who we are, come into the more. But I think Tyler makes a very good point about it's not being modeled very much. And
Well,
this is a really huge element of, I think, what's so important about your work, our work, is attempting to bring more modeling of how this can be done.
Yeah, got to show people.
I would argue that the unhelpful ways are modeled.
Yeah.
And I wanted to Mick, I wanted to ask you, in your book, the chapter "Making It Happen." I was curious if you could talk about that a little bit and how it relates to this topic that we're discussing with this positive parenting. So talking about modeling, a lot of times clients, however they find their way to this information later, they come into therapy. But if we're talking about an ideal situation where we could start integrating this information into someone's life early on, preventative, what does that look like? What do you envision?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of knowledge now of how to do that. There's some great work in social and emotional literacy programs, working in schools where they're teaching kids really basic skills around how to empathize with others, how to understand how other people are feeling. And we know that these programs are evidence-based to improve levels of empathy amongst kids. Also learning how to manage their emotions, learning how to mentalize, as well as the positive parenting programs, which can help parents learn and parents carers learn how to provide the kind of security and attachment. And I think that one of the things we have in our society is that we have the knowledge about how to bring up kids in a more emotionally healthy way, in a way that they can achieve more of that well-being in their lives. And it seems what I talk about in the book is really that there's such a potential there to be bringing that into our everyday curricula, everyday lives, everyday society. And for me, those are the points of the greatest leverage around, changing the school system. And going back to the question you were asking, Kirk, about what are we doing? I think that trying to talk, I mean, we're still in very early days in task, but I think trying to talk to policymakers, trying to talk to politicians, and there's groups like Compassion in Politics, which are really focused on trying to bring in principles of compassion, caring, relatedness, emotional literacy into into the educational system, but also into the political systems. There's some really interesting work about how politicians talk to each other. And going back to, Tyler, what you were saying about modeling, when our politicians are modeling aggressive, angry, projective ways of relating, it doesn't leave much hope for the rest of us. And Compassion in Politics have been working in government to talk to politicians, to help them find ways to relate to others and to themselves. I mean, a big issue is around self-care and just recognizing how much in government, how much people struggle with self-care themselves. But I think, for me, a lot of existential learning and existential questioning comes back to something around kind of this humility of having things open. The most important existential philosopher for me was Martin Buber, and his work on what it means to relate in dialogue. And I think that's what I think that we can contribute most as a community, is that potential for dialogue, that potential for openness, that ability to mentalize the other and to mentalize ourselves, to recognize what we're feeling and what the other might be feeling, so that we can engage in conversations, I guess, maybe less about the content of those conversations, but just as you're doing, Kirk, about having dialogues about difficult issues. And I think in task, what we're doing is, I mean, a lot of the work at the moment is quite reflexive. And I think trying to find the nuances and trying to find those positions of openness, trying to get away from kind of certaintism, if you like, that kind of, because I think in many ways, certaintism is the kind of opposite of dialogue, saying, I know this is what people need to do. Moving away from a politics that is about certainties to one which can bear and tolerate the complexities, the nuances, the differences, the diversities, the uncertainties that existentialism teaches us are the reality and to bear the kind of anxiety, Kurt, that you've been relating. I don't think that comes from certainty. I think certainty is a way of kind of avoiding that. I think, yeah, but you know, that begins with us in many ways. Well, that's a big part of it, is looking at us. And you know, even if you look in the therapeutic world, as we all know, the drive towards certainty and definiteness, and I know right and you know, I'm right and you're wrong. We're not, you know, we can look at other people about them not modeling, but are we the best models?
Yeah.
You know, are we doing the best modeling we can? I think in some ways that's the challenge, is to start with ourselves.
Well, I don't want to go over that so quickly, and I want to pause there because I think that's such a profound point, and talking about taking some of these principles from existential therapy and you know, relating them to the world outside of the consulting room, which I think is kind of the theme of today. I often have this conversation about the existential givens when I tell people what I do, and when they're not in the field, or even some that are in the field that are just not in EH, in the field of psychology, the response is they look kind of like this 1,000-yard stare of, oh, these topics are so esoteric and out there. And Mick, to your point a few minutes ago, I think that there's this detachment that we have with these topics because we are not sitting, or Emmy, you were talking about this as well, just going on a walk and contemplating our own death. What things are we closer to than the givens of existence, right? Those four givens. They feel so distant because of the distance that we're putting in there, right? But to be able to take something like focusing on process and not just content into how we relate and converse with people in our everyday world.
I mean, so I'm a bit, I mean, you know, we have a scope and we have a range in the existential therapies, and that's one of the great things about us. I'm a bit more cautious about the givens, because I think for me there's a certain, you know, certaintism again of there are these four things that are universal, and if you don't experience it, it's because you're in denial, and really, you know, these are the things. I think you know, they're great insights, and I think from a pluralistic standpoint, we would say that for some people, some of the time they can be incredibly insightful, and you know, like Emmy's fantastic videos, you know, really help. I know how much they really help people, but also that I think we have to be cautious about assuming that these are then the truths for everybody, and that for some people, there's, you know, CBT ideas do a fantastic job of helping them gain insights, and for other people. And I think for me, again, you know, the real insight from existential therapy comes from that ability to sit with that uncertainty and not falling into any definitive answers, but being able to have answers. You know, pluralism is about having answers. It's not about saying, well, everything's relative. It's about recognizing there can be these really important points of learning, but we can also still hold some distance just so that we can allow difference and diversity to be there, and to be able to learn and to be in dialogue together.
I think it always comes back to that, really. And that is not a specific existential skill either. All psychotherapists know that it comes back to listening, maybe not to dialogue, but to listening. And I just wanted to mention something about that, of some of the work that I've done some, you know, 2 decades ago or so, well, in the 90s and the early noughties, when Digby Tantum, my husband, and myself were co-chairs of the Center for the Study of Conflict and Reconciliation at the University of Sheffield. And one of our colleagues, who was called, well, now is Lord John Alderdice, was working with us at the center. And he was also a psychotherapist, and he was involved with the Northern Ireland negotiations. So we were regularly kind of posted on what was happening. And what was fed into those Northern Ireland negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement was very much what an American did in those negotiations. You may not be aware of that, but it was Senator George Mitchell who led this whole process. And he was bringing into that process just one thing, basically. And that thing was, we're going to take 2 years to do nothing but listen. We're not going to fight. We're not going to argue. We're all silly buggers here. We're all going to lose something. Nobody will get what they want. But what we are going to do is really come out of here knowing what each other feel and think about it at a very deep level. And that's what they did. They listened to dozens and dozens of people and all the 8 parties that were, directly involved. And they listened and they listened, and then they listened some more, and then there would be an objection, and then they'd listen some more. And there was a kind of taboo on dialogue for a long time because people had unlearned to make the other important enough to be listened to. They were just, all at each other's, well, they were all killing each other, basically. It was absolutely dreadful situation in Northern Ireland for decades. And they kind of slowed it down, and they kind of got to a position where they were all able to say things about what the minimum was that they would need to get out to be able to sell it to their party. And gradually it fell into place by avoiding arguing, by avoiding really having conversations with each other for a long time, but each of them coming to them to be listened to and get it all off their chest. And I think this is such a powerful example of how all these knots were gradually undone just by the magic of somebody being allowed to get things off their chest and really having the opportunity for 2 years, that lasted for 2 years, to keep talking about it until they themselves began to see what their difficulty was. They weren't clear themselves until they had been listened to. And so that, I think, is a very important thing that is lost in society at large. Taking time, finding situations in which people can trust again because they're getting heard.
Yeah.
They're not just learning to respect each other and their diversity, but each of them gets sufficient time and attention to feel heard and therefore to begin to develop what they actually think about the situation. It's like it melts the ice and the water starts to flow. And then when the water comes together, it isn't in opposition anymore because actually the process has already happened.
I mean, I think for me, what you're describing there, Emmy, is something which is such a beautiful description of so much of what happens in psychotherapy. And I think the kind of parallels between, that kind of depth listening and how that can be so influential in the political process. And it makes me think of just how much in therapy, I mean, that's one part of therapy, and it's such an important part. I think there's so much that happens in that therapeutic process that has the potential for serving a function in those wider debates, in those wider political processes, and really contributing to a world where people can feel listened to, where people can talk, where, as you say, those waters can flow together more and things can melt. We know that from the consulting room, that we can really make a difference to people's lives and people can open up. And I think, we maybe talk about responsibility and existential responsibility. I think as a community of existential therapists and therapists, there is some responsibility to take that knowledge, that wisdom, if you like, and share that in the world that can make a positive difference. Because we need to, if we're bystanders and everybody else is a bystander, that it's a desperate time. It's a time of crisis, massive crisis.
Yes, and it's all hands on deck. We need to share what we know about this.
Absolutely. It also reminds me of the importance of what we call contact theory. It's a social psychological theme that has good research behind it, from what I understand, which is basically that people from very different backgrounds are freed up to a notable degree to relate to others from different backgrounds when they meet them, when they actually have a chance to meet them and learn that, you know, these people don't have horns, or they're not devils like they've been taught often by their leaders or in their dogma, whether it's ideological or religious. And they've shown this in studies, that that kind of contact in terms of helping people, especially who are extreme in their ideology, or even destructiveness toward the other, is much more powerful than trying to educate them in a direct way necessarily. But
it goes way back to Kurt Lewin's work in the 1930s, doesn't it? Where he worked in the Bronx and he discovered that if you take gangs that were killing each other and you take them onto a holiday together, where you give them projects to do together and they have a common objective, they mingle, they become one group within a very, very brief time. We know all this stuff, but we kind of forgotten it.
Yeah. And I've forgotten about that particular research, but
it's very powerful. Kurt Lewin did it all, honestly. Look at his work again. He's done all of this stuff. He's got all the factual proof about how these things work.
But Kurt Lewin, I mean, as a social psychologist, he understood things in a social context. And I think in many ways, the world of psychotherapy, too often we've moved away from that, and we've moved away, I guess, because of the nature of our work is often with individuals, but it means that we've shut down and we've focused on those intra-psychic processes. And I think one of the great contributions of existential thinking and Heidegger and being in the world is that the constant reminder that we exist within a world. And it gives a philosophical foundation really to understanding people within their context, whether it's ecological models, Brockenbrenner, or systems theory, or the very many different models. A lot of that is rooted in existential understandings that don't just focus on some inner process of the individual. People like the Daseins analysts and Boss and Binswanger, who write so compellingly about the kind of ways of reconceptualizing the person in a very in-depth psychological way, but allow us to understand the person and the person right down to the very emotions, the things that we consider most fundamentally inside the person. Boss talks about that as being between the person and their world, the openness of the person to the world. I think that leaves a foundation for thinking very socially and socially culturally that, you know, colleagues of ours like Louis Hoffman have then taken forward and looked at in terms of cultural factors.
Yeah, and even your research, which focuses or emphasizes the resources of the client, the resources of the therapist, the richness of the relationship, right? As being, I think it's like 55% of the variance of effective healing, right? Effective psychotherapy.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends which model you look at, but people like Bruce Wampole would certainly argue that I think sometimes it gets up to 90% is the kind of client factors. You know, more goes on in client. I mean, one of the biggest determinants is the client's levels of social support. We know that that's one of the biggest impacts on outcomes.
Well, and I think what we're saying too is a lot of it is about having a witness who can help bring out those resources in the client, who can help to hold that and to meet the person, to support the person, to feel safe enough to connect or reconnect with parts of themselves that they've blocked off, and to open their vision of themselves and of relationships to others. So I'd like to home in on that aspect as well, because so we're talking about the importance of listening, of being with, but there's a certain skill involved here too.
Yeah,
And there's often a structure that can be helpful, right?
yeah.
Bringing a structure. I mean, just bringing people together, it can sometimes be disastrous. We saw
Oh,
some of that
yes.
at Esalen when I know the director Michael Murphy brought Black Panthers and some of the Esalen folks together just to kind of go,
Shake it up.
connect. Yeah, shake it up and connect with each other. But it ended up a kind of a yelling match.
Yeah.
More
A bit like
guardrail.
when Rogers and Lang met
Yeah.
in the
Oh,
Hilton
That's
Hotel
a
in London.
story.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
yes. So my question to you both is how I think we're implying that a lot of the folks within our arena of healing are needed out there
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
facilitate some of these discussions. But how do we bring ourselves in? How do we um, make it comfortable enough for people to even see, quote, professionals uh, as people,
Yeah.
who are down to earth and who
I
are
think it's social
available.
media, Kirk. I think that is the future. The virtual world is where these things can happen in ways that we couldn't do them before. I mean, I've always run groups and I've always worked with couples alongside my individual work. But what you can do online is so much bigger and so much more direct in many ways. Trouble is, of course, that if you don't watch out, all those media get taken over by these forces that go in the other direction, where it's all about competition and it's all about seeming to be rather than actually being, and it's about forcing people to follow certain steps, or it's all very dictatorial very easily. So
Right.
the question is really, how are we going to make sure that we use the facilities at our disposal in a way that opens them up and makes them available in this creative and communal kind of way to as many people as possible? And I'm sure it's going to be a virtual thing.
I agree with you that that's the new reality.
Yeah,
I do think there's an existential irony there too, right? Of relating
that's so.
through an 11-inch screen as distinct from raw
Yeah.
contact, person to person, human to human. Do you feel like that's a shortcoming of the election?
No, I
I don't.
personally think it's liberating.
Yeah. I
Be-
mean,
Because as I speak to you and you're sitting, in the morning in California and I'm sitting in the evening in Sussex in the United Kingdom, but you're talking about things that I can't see, but you're describing them and I'm imagining them, and that imagination is between you and I, and it doesn't need presence in the room. We connect through the images that we transport to each other in this virtual world, and it works perfectly well. I feel connected to you.
That's such
Easy,
a
more easily to you and Mick, obviously, than to Tyler, who I don't know that well yet. But nevertheless, I am observing Tyler and the way he speaks and the way he looks at the camera. And very gradually, I can see that, Tyler and you are already close. And so we're building a little community there. The four of us are building a little community.
Can
we
resonate.
did
And that's real.
research on relational depth in online relationships and compared it
Yeah.
with face to face. And actually, the levels that people reported, clients reported, was as strong as in face to face.
Ah, we
And
got better than that. We found they were better
we found
online
out
than in
better.
face to face.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, what we found in our research was that there was things that for some people were inhibitors. So for some people, and I think it's a very individual thing. I think we need again to be cautious about saying everybody prefers this or everybody prefers that, because there's a real difference that some people felt that they didn't get the presence and that they didn't have the same kind of connection. But other people actually, as Emmy was saying, felt more connection. They felt that they were more freed up, they were less inhibited.
Yeah.
And I think
We actually
appreciating these kind
compared
of diverse, different ways in which
we
people
actually
can
compared the
appreciate
same
things is really
course,
important.
the same course being taught online or in face to face, and then asked the same questions to students all around Europe. So these were courses we created with a European project, and they were run in Poland and Italy and Portugal and many other places. And then we did this big piece of research. And of course, there were those people who preferred this and those people who preferred that. But according to the questions we asked about what they preferred about and what they didn't prefer, what we found was that in emotional terms, they felt able to be more disclosing and more open online than in face to face. And then we began, this was completely against our expectations. It was specifically about self-disclosure, that self-disclosure is easier because you feel protected, you feel in your own environment. And so you have a kind of safety there that you don't have if you sit in a group in a strange building and you're being looked at by lots of people that you don't really know all that well.
Yeah, it's
So
the
we
online
shouldn't
disinhibition
underestimate the
effect.
power of this.
Yeah, this online disinhibition effect is pretty well documented that, people
Exactly.
can really feel disinhibited.
Exactly.
Doesn't work for everybody, but for a lot of people it can be
Yeah.
there. And I think it means that we need to be open to having ideas about presence and what presence is and
Yeah.
all these kinds of things challenged and being able to be flexible enough
Well,
to
and there's also
develop.
new generations coming up that are habituated to
Yeah, they're
that
used to
kind of
it.
medium. So that's a
Yeah.
good frame in itself, and we have
Yeah,
to
Yeah,
well,
deal with it.
absolutely right.
and the next thing, of course, with artificial intelligence and then what connection's going to mean. I was talking at the conference this weekend about the AI thou relationship, we're going to have,
Oh,
can you,
Uber's rolling.
yeah, what would Boober say? I don't think Boober would have been a big fan of artificial
No,
intelligence,
I
but,
don't think Buber would count that as a Tao relationship, though,
yeah,
would
but
he?
can you have dialogue? Can you have genuine dialogue? I think not. I think there's something about co-intentionality that means that you have to have kind of active presences. But these are the kind of questions that we need to look at and we need to debate because it's going to be there whether we like it or not. And certainly in the therapy world, AI in therapy is going to be a massive thing. I don't think anybody
Yeah,
thinks no.
Yeah,
inevitably.
I just wrote a piece called Raw which is, really challenging, questioning, can we have that experience of awe and of connection through the AI medium in the
If
same
the
way as,
AI is the therapist, you mean?
yeah, or the therapist, or just relating to an AI. It
Right.
seems to me that the whole issue of the stakes involved are very different. The stakes involved in the emotional investment
Mm,
in a like a bucket of machinery
mm,
that has no emotional stake
Mhm.
in that
mm.
relationship is
But
very
I think
different.
you're underestimating what AI is going to be like in 10 years' time, Kirk.
Maybe.
I think you'll find that the time will come if you listen to Elon Musk, the time is near when they can make robots that will be more credible as human beings than human beings, that
I,
have a wider range of emotion than most human beings, that
uh,
can entertain a wider range of thought and a wider range of options in choice making than most people are capable. So I think we
I,
shouldn't worry too much about that. What
well,
we might want to worry about is who's going to teach who.
yeah, I hear you. I just wonder about the appearance versus the reality issue. And is it
Mm.
more performative? And will that performative aspect, be witnessed differently, especially as people realize that it is a performance. It's not coming from one's core depths. But this is all to be discovered. I'm with you.
I think there are so many human beings that are performative and that don't connect to their core, that human beings are entirely used to that, and they will have no trouble buying AI psychotherapists when they're good enough. Once they're good enough, well, already they're not bad, but they'll be a lot better in 10 years' time.
Fascinating. I don't know. Tyler, did you have some thoughts?
So many, so many. Yeah, especially I'm just happy to be, present for this conversation. We're talking about culture, and I don't want to backtrack too much because for the sake of time, but I just really appreciated, translating this idea of being witnessed to, but in a social setting, and how do we facilitate that? So Kirk, I appreciate, your emphasis there and the work that you do, and getting into this idea, Emmy, that you brought up of the benefit, not just the replacement of Zoom is great if we can't be around each other because of COVID, which is definitely true, but how can telehealth augment the process, which I hadn't thought about that. I've seen the benefits when I was a group therapist when I lived in Portland, Oregon. Have a group and there'd be members from all across the state. And so that was a benefit for them. In a rural area, they can log on and they can definitely benefit from. But I didn't think about this idea of this therapeutic kind of triad that is happening as well. How is telehealth adding to their experience and not taking away? But as you mentioned, we can be in different time zones. And although I'm not in the room with you, I didn't shake your hand or greet you in person or know what it smells, feels like to be there. I can imagine what the sunset might be like right now for you, and that can add to my, if it is in fact right now.
It's gone, by the way. It's dark. It's pitch dark here now.
Oh, there we go. Now I don't have but the benefit of now I can use this mentalization to put myself in your experience rather than just bringing you into my office and having you try to be comfortable there. So I appreciated that. And especially someone that is in my early stage of my career, I never imagined that I would be doing therapy or teaching online. And now it's becoming more, I go to a school where I take all my courses remotely, and then we meet up for a residential conference. And so much of training programs now are hybrid. You could live in a different, state and perform therapy and training. And so go ahead.
No, just said amazing. I'm agreeing with you. Yeah.
So I think it is such an interesting conversation, and I'm particularly interested in culture and where existential therapy comes into that, and like individual versus collectivist culture. And I was curious what the two of you thought about how that translates across different cultural groups. If there's
Well, we know because we're working with our colleagues everywhere, and it translates in different ways. I mean, this is the fascinating thing, when you travel around the world teaching existential therapy to people in, goodness, what have I done? China, India, Israel, Turkey, Greece, Scandinavia, America, Canada, Australia, you name it. They all do it in different ways. They all automatically assume that their background culture is going to be part of the therapy, because that is kind of in awareness when you work existentially. Culture is within your awareness. It's something that matters. You respect the person's culture. You look at what values are important to them. You don't impose stuff. So naturally, in each culture, people are going to use existential ideas in quite different ways. And still, there is that same depth search for the things that truly matter to people. And moreover, in all these culture, it's the same damn things that matter to people. Everybody is moved by getting close to another human being. Everybody wants more love in their lives, not just to be loved, but to have more things and more people and more ideas that are lovable and that make their life loving and lovable. Everybody wants those things. Everybody knows that it is important to have better human relations. Everybody realizes that to make sense of things and to find meaning in things is
They
important,
both
but
froze.
they might do it in different ways. And that makes it more interesting because we don't want a one-way street. We want many streets.
Leaving room for them, yeah.
Yeah. And we learn from each other. I mean, gosh, we learn so much from each other. It's just incredible. Even without doing it deliberately, you know. I've had this long relationship with Kirk. I mean, we've known each other since the early 90s. And I've had this long sort of suspicion of Kirk's humanism, you know, because, well, it's too American and too here and now and this sort of thing. But you know, this man over the years has completely turned me around about that. And now I find myself saying to people, yeah, well, what I was saying earlier, you know, it is when you will face your fear of nothing that the presence will come to you, and then you will be in the moment. And it's just all come together somehow by thinking about it together. Just
Yeah.
an example of how we do that.
We've learned from each other.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You want to transition into the conferences and talk about those a little bit now? Or Kirk, did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
Well, there's so much. I mean, one of the major themes is the increasing authoritarianism, I think, that we see in the world, both in our country and U.S. and abroad, and just how we're doing in addressing that, you know, and how you two see existential psychology's role in addressing that. Can it pierce the opposite, you know, the counter trend, which is toward cutting off dialogue and toward certainty and dogma?
Mhm.
Uh, are we little ants running up a mountain, or do you have more hope?
I mean,
Oh,
I
I have
think
huge
that's
hope.
such a good question, Kurt. And you know, what role existential thinking and perspectives can play in challenging that authoritarian you know, that worldview and the kind of the moves towards more democratic um, stance, which appreciates diversity. I guess we need to, you know, how much thinking have we done about that? I mean, I think that's a really important area for our development and as a movement is thinking about how we translate those kinds of existential ideas. I mean, I think if we look at some of the humanists and some of the you know, people in the history of it, well, psychodynamics as well, you know, people like Adorno. I'm not quite sure where he came from, but you know, they challenge people like from a humanist background, and some existentialism challenged and looked at the kind of roots of fascism. Um, Certainly some of that has existential elements. I mean, when you look at what Fromm writes about the kind of people wanting to give up their freedom and the burden of freedom, it relates very much to Rolla May and those kinds of ideas. But I think in a sense, we probably need to revitalize some of those ideas and update them and nuance them. And as Tyler was talking about about seeing them in a multicultural context and think about what role existentialism can play on that political landscape. Same with climate, really. I mean, you know, how do we bring in existential ideas to address issues like climate? How do we bring in existential ideas to address issues like war? I think Emmy gave a really nice example there. But there's a lot of contemporary challenges that we face as a movement. You know, maybe there's a new existentialism that will really look at how we, and take these challenges seriously.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think what we'll need new thinking. I don't think we can just go back to Fromm. I think we need to really think about what a contemporary existential approach looks like, and then think about how does it address issues like Trumpism, populism, both in terms of theory and understanding those movements, and then also in terms of practice and who are we? Who are we actually going to be? I mean, like Emmy was talking about social media. Is it something about social media? Is it, as Tyler was talking about, is it about modeling something? Is it about talking to politicians? Is existentialism the right term for it? Humanism, I think personally for me, I think conveys something very intuitively meaningful to people, maybe person-centeredness as well. I'm not so sure about existentialism, if I'm honest. I think the meaning is less evident.
Well,
And
can I just say
maybe,
something about that, Mick? Humanism is about human beings. I would like to think that it is about more than that. It is
sure.
about the planet as well.
Yeah,
It
of
is
course.
about what is beyond the planet as
Yeah.
well. It is about, all the unknown and infinity that we need to take into account in some way. So humanism is never going to be enough as far as I'm concerned. It's always got to be a broader envelope than that. And I think we need to get back to somebody you haven't named and who is often forgotten, and that is Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt was very much on about these things, and she wrote a little book called The Freedom to be Free. And that is not just some play on words. The whole book is about to show how human beings cannot be free until they understand what it actually means to claim their freedom, and they are enabled to become free and to claim their freedom. And I think this is what we need to dare be more aware of. And I'm going to do a little plugging. So my new book with Penguin is called The Art of Freedom. And it is all exactly about that. It is about taking the ideas of existential thinking and repackaging them in a much more concrete, up-to-date way, but putting the emphasis in on how they should be enabling people to think about how unfree they are in so many different ways, because it is only when it becomes obvious to you that you are unfree that you're going to desire your freedom and that you're going to wonder about what it would be like to be more free. And as long as you're not free, you're kind of blind. And as long as you're blind, you're going to be led by people who promise you the earth, although anybody who is free will understand that those promises will never be made good, because they cannot be made good, because as we all know in this room, life is not like that. It is freedom comes from understanding limits as well as possibilities. And it is not about, us needing a Father Christmas who promises a big presents for Christmas and then says, oh, sorry, there was no money, so I can't give it you now. That way of doing politics and that way of people running democracy is a joke. That's not democracy anymore. This is what we see happening all around the world. People think they are voting and they're electing, but that's not what's happening. It's populism. It's exactly populism. It's people being made promises because they feel so in such a bad way that they're going to go for the highest bidder. They're going to go for the person who promises them the most. We all know that those promises won't be kept.
Yeah.
But they will still vote for those people. And so we've got a real problem. And the only way you can unwind that ball of string is by going right to the middle of it and starting from there. Because you've got to help people think about those issues. When am I free? When am I unfree? In what ways am I living my freedom? Do I even want this freedom? Or do I want to be like a little robot that is getting programmed, and will I say yes and amen to my leaders who will make vain promises and then will say, oh, but now in fact what we're going to do is X, Y, and Z, and now I'm a lot worse off rather than a lot better off. That's what we see happening everywhere.
Somebody's got to be there for the backlash.
Yeah.
It's better
Well,
than
this is
not
it.
being-
This is
I
it.
think I
I'm
think one
with
of
you.
the challenges though is how we do that and how we engage with people in a way that doesn't then say, well, we've got the answers and we know what's right, and the way that you're seeing the world is, we're going to educate you about how to see the world truly. Because, on the one hand, there is a knowledge and there's a critique and there's a challenge, but I think that one of the challenge, I mean, there's a lot of debates about what happened with Kamala Harris and why she didn't win. And I think one is that the left, the Democrats, were seen as kind of out of touch, as patronizing, as not understanding, as thinking they had all the answers. Um, and certainly, if I think about, I was in the States last summer, and when we were talking to people, most of whom were very pro-Trump, for them to have some conversation with them, I mean, there's a real nuance in having that conversation and changing people's attitudes. I think takes a lot of and challenging people and having dialogue. For me, that dialogue and that possibility, it's difficult to do that from a place of, look, these are the answers, this is what you need to see. So I think getting that balance between being able to present people with alternative positions, but also respecting how people see it and seeing that humanity that is there. I think if we start from a position of a humanity, then there's a risk that we alienate people even further.
Well, there's certainly that risk, but you yourself were speaking about what is being done in some schools in the UK, and I know the same is happening in the schools I know of my grandchildren in New Jersey in the United States, which is to teach kids some of those basic skills, and that is an educational process. They need to be, taught what their emotions are and what they tell them and how to handle them and how to handle them with each other. We can't do it without education, as you very well know, but education doesn't have to be dogmatic. It can be process-based and it can be fact-based, and it can leave people a lot of freedom to interpret what they learn in many different ways. And that's obviously the kind of education that is needed, but not just in schools, also for people, at different levels of society, definitely in organizations and definitely within politics, I think, where people still seem to believe that shouting at each other is the best way and that crushing each other is a good way, which we know is simply not true. So there is knowledge that we have that other people don't have, and we shouldn't withhold it for fear of being seen to be wanting to influence people.
I think that's where the thinking needs to happen, Emmy. I think you're absolutely right, and I've learned so much from you about that. But I think getting that balance between holding that knowledge and having that knowledge and that humility of listening and openness, I'm not sure we've got that right yet. I think that's some of the work that we need to do.
I'm with both of you. And at the least, I think we're going to have to learn to live with very different perspectives. And certainly in our society, I mean, we already have Texas school system, which is seriously considering a biblical or Christian oriented education for the public education, at least to have that option. I think we're going to have to learn to somehow get along. It's a very basic question, but it's really powerful and it's going to take powerful movement.
Well, leaving room for this diversity of thought, right? Yeah. And so I think about, what drives our desire and our functioning of attacking the other if we disagree. I don't think we're trying to move into having a, this homogenous way of thinking, but how do we have the diversity of thought and not feel like we need to attack the other when we are not speaking the same truth?
Back to the listening again.
Back to listening and dialogue and bridge building and
Well, we've been
skill.
talking about listening and we've been talking about educating, and I guess there's a dialectic between the two, which is maybe for me that's what dialogue would be, is that dialectic between listening and educating and engaging.
Well, we're at the least we're making it available. And
Very good.
really powerful. Much more prominent, visible, and I love the declaration of mobilizing the forces of, I might call it depth, the depth dimension. I love what you said about Hannah Arendt. I'd also bring Tillich here with the whole the depth dimension, the need
Yes.
for
And Jaspers bringing in the comprehensive dimension.
the comprehensive,
Carl Jaspers.
working with fear, with our fears. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Situation.
I'm sorry.
Limit situations.
Yes. Yes. Coming to those limits, working with them. So maybe just in the few minutes we have left, you could say some about the upcoming conference, Into the Wild, and the World Congress, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, well, the World Congress, you might be better placed than I am to speak about, Kirk, though. But let me talk about our online conference, which is the annual Existential Movement Conference, and that will be 2 days on the 7th and the 8th of February 2025. And the topic is Into the Wild Woods. Existential responses to turbulent times. And we have an amazing array of speakers from many different countries. And I don't have the list here, I'm afraid, so I can't read it out. But it can be found soon on the Existential Movement website, and we will be publicizing it lots. And it should be very good indeed. I really look forward to it. You will be speaking. I'm sure Mick will be speaking. Yes. I will be speaking. Tyler might even be speaking in the student slot.
That would be wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So that's getting us energized. And Mick, do you have any announcement about an upcoming conference or anything about maybe?
If people are interested in the Therapy and Change Social Change Network, do Google Therapy and Social Change Network, and you can find our website. We have a Facebook group, we have regular seminars, we have a WhatsApp group that is very, very lively. If you can keep up with hundreds of messages a day, you're very welcome. Yeah, and there's lots of lively discussions, and I think just exploring the issue of therapy from across the orientations and its interface with social change and social justice.
Thanks.
I should also mention the Rome conference. So that's a face-to-face conference of the Federation for Existential Therapists in Europe. Yes. And that conference is called Wisdom in Practice, from existential training to therapeutic encounter. And that's 2 days as well in Rome, May 21st and 23rd. Yeah. And that also has a lot of very interesting speakers as well. And of course, going to Rome, if you can afford it, is going to be a fantastic thing to do.
Well, a number of us are going to be there, and it's also a part of that wider movement that is represented by the World Congress of Existential Therapy, which you are a great inspiration of as well, Emmy. And
you have the dates for the 2026 meeting there.
That's in 2026.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have it right.
I can find it probably.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what the dates are, but people can look that up. on the website for the Fourth World Congress.
Oh, yes, that is.
The Denver conference is in June 2026, the 9th, well, no, the 3rd to the 6th, right?
June 3rd through June 6th, 2026. And in Denver, it'll be in the US.
Denver, Colorado.
But
Yeah.
part of the point I wanted to make was that this movement is worldwide. It needs to be worldwide. It needs to be about humanity and not one humanity in particular, in my view, and I think in our shared view. And it is another chance to have exchanges about how we bring these humanistic existential principles, depth principles, to a broken world in many ways, a very challenged world.
Yeah,
From
the world
various
in trouble too.
World on fire.
Yeah, world on fire, Mick. Yes, that's a very good metaphor. It
Puts it very
definitely is.
concrete.
It literally is in so many ways.
Yeah, true. Well,
I'm going to write that down, Mick. I'm going to write that down. World on fire.
A world on fire, can existentialism douse the flames?
Is there enough water?
well put. Well put. Well, I guess we're all fire people in our own way.
Yeah, exactly.
Very
So in good
personal.
existential tradition, we need to find a way to use that fire rather than to use it to destroy things, to use it in some creative way.
It's
And
a
that's got to be the purpose. Yeah.
double phrase. Fire persons who have a fire that can be applied as well, but also to douse the fire. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was terrific. I feel.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for
onward.
Thanks, Tyler.
sharing this space with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for organizing it
Yeah.
and for doing all this. It's fabulous. Wonderful. Keep going. Keep going.
Likewise.